everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Championship week is over. We had some winners, some losers. I won one league, lost two other finals, fell short in making money in the overall contest for the NFFC Primetime League because my players utterly collapsed in the third week of the playoffs, but I had a good run. At least I had a sweat, so that's all we can ask sometimes. Nick, we're on to week 18. I know most of your irons were not in the fire this past week. You had really good runs and then ran into like the buzzsaw at the wrong time.
More or less, yeah. That's a polite way to frame it. Great regular season, tell you that. I had a lot of teams. I think three of my, kind of 7 or 8 teams that I really care about finished number one in points, and all three went out in the second round. So I was playing for a lot of third place games, which, it's hard to get up for those games.
Yes.
Motivation is at an all-time low. Still setting a lineup. You're not just going to hand that to somebody, but was not going into week 17 and certainly not last night sweating as much as a lot of people were. But very cool to see all the best ball stuff on social last night. People taking home big time prizes, and the amount of foresight, obviously some luck involved when you're playing the season long best ball, but for everything to come down to what ended up being a crazy game between the Falcons and the Rams, right? We have a lot of people, needing something for Puka, a lot of people hoping that it would be a quiet Puka game. You have the catch, not catch that swung a lot of leagues at the very end of that game. Ended up being a disaster night for Matthew Stafford. A great night if you were somehow rostering the Atlanta Falcons defense. Just a fittingly wacky end, I think, to what has been an overall pretty wacky fantasy football season.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it was. And, that game, Bijan fed a lot of families with that at the end there. I ran into Bijan in a championship game, I lost that game. Yeah. My one Bijan share got knocked out in the semis, I think it was the RotoWire Invitational, where I had a great team. I had of all the, I think 60. I think we had 5 leagues, or was it 6 leagues? I was second in overall points in the whole contest, and I got knocked out in the first round of the playoffs, of course, because that's the way it goes sometimes. Just get in the tournament there. So that was one of my, one of those stud teams. I had Bijan and I had McBride. I was like, that was a winning combo all year.
I know, man. I know. And look, if we could have capped the season at week 13, we would have been in great shape. But I'm curious, just from a bigger picture perspective, we don't want to dig too much into the minutia on this episode, with it being the end of the fantasy season. We'll still talk a little week 18. We'll talk big performances from week 17, but I think there's a lot of big picture stuff to discuss. So I'm curious for you personally, who victimized you most this season? Whether it was, a pick that you whiffed on, you wish you could do it over in the regular season, somebody who did sustain you throughout the regular season and then, had a bad stretch at the worst possible time. Who are the guys that you're going to be ruining throughout this offseason?
Well, this is easy. If I was at the back end of the draft, I didn't get Puka or Taylor. I got Brian Thomas and others in that range there. A very easy answer. That I did not get any Puka all year long. And granted, Puka didn't carry you in the championship game, but he got you enough that if you had a decent team, that you weren't really ruining what he did for you. You got that late touchdown, and he certainly got you to the finals. That's for sure. Because the 2 previous weeks he was just insane. Not having him and staying away from him because I was worried about the magic healing tent bus trailer that Matthew Stafford's back was going through there on that hokum. I stayed away from Stafford and from Puka, and to my regret, and having Brian Thomas Jr. in his place. He's back. He doesn't lose the junior anymore. He's still Brian Thomas Jr.
Yeah.
That there is the biggest, that was my biggest whiff of the season there. And I did that in multiple leagues where I ended up on him. Maybe I had Drake London instead of Puka. That didn't work out as well either. Obviously, London had some games, but that injury at the end of the year just destroyed those teams as well. So I'll say that was the big aspect there. Not Puka-ing, not getting as many Taylor shares as I needed to. I had one Taylor share. That was a league winner. And so even though he was not as good down the stretch as he was in the middle of the season, you bank those wins in the middle of the season. It got me a bye in the first round of the playoffs. I needed that bye week because I was awful that first week, but I won the league. So there you go.
Yeah, I had very little Jonathan Taylor exposure as well. In the leagues where I got him, it almost felt like a consolation, or it's like, man, I really wanted Bucky Irving. Man, I really wish I had Chase Brown, or I was kind of prioritizing Josh Jacobs there. And, it became clear 2 games into the season that was going to be one of the bigger windfalls For me, I feel like my issues were more so at wide receiver, where I had a lot of Drake London. And when London was out there for the most part this season, he was productive. Too many missed games, too many weeks where, not only am I not able to start him, but I can't confidently start Brian Thomas. I can't start Marvin Harrison Jr., where you're just kind of spinning the wheel. Had to start Yoshivas in a couple leagues down the stretch. That was a tough one to accept. The idea of Yoshivas eating with Joe Burrow ended up being significantly better than the execution. But I would put both London and Harrison on the list. I had a league where I had Brian Thomas as an 8th round keeper, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I mean, what a value, right? I mean, getting one guy in round 8 and like 3 weeks into the year, I'm like, I don't even think I can start this guy right now.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is wide receiver is a disaster all year. Here's the ADP from the NFFC primetime list at wide receiver. Jamar Chase was a first rounder. Okay,
of course.
He didn't kill you. I didn't see a lot of Jamar Chase League winners out there, but he also wasn't the reason you didn't win. CeeDee Lamb was disappointing for the price. My NFFC primetime team made the playoffs. I was threatening money, but Lamb did nothing on Christmas Day, and he is actually kind of small all year, only 3 touchdowns all season. Justin Jefferson was your wide receiver 3. Malik Neighbors, wide receiver 4. Brian Thomas, wide receiver 5. There were a lot of misses out there. That's kind of the point. Look at the top 10 wide receivers: Chase, Lamb, Jefferson, Neighbors, Thomas, Amon-Ra, Nico, London. Puka is wide receiver 9. Ladd McConkey was wide receiver 10. He was a disaster this year, but you could have gotten it right. You could have gone the guy in my primetime league went Amon-Ra, Puka, JSN. His first 3 picks.
There you go.
That's an answer key right there. He dominated. Michael Edelman. He did very well. I think he won the silver bullet as well. So really good player all the way around.
Yeah, the Puka thing is tough because I think you and I were on the same page as far as, it wasn't a hard fade of Puka. It was like, all right, I'll take him if he's there, but he's not my target. And it did feel like every single week there was a moment where he's heading to the blue medical tent and you're like, all right, this is the reason I faded Puka. But he always came back. That was the thing. Like, this is the year that, it kind of went like last year as far as the injuries go, but he always came back in game and obviously had a monster season. I mean, I feel like we don't even have to talk about JSN. I mean, that's kind of that. He was kind of the Jonathan Taylor of receivers, right? Where you knew like 2 or 3 weeks into the year, oh boy, I don't have enough JSN. This is going to be his year. And, Puka, ended up surging to the point where those guys are kind of co-MVPs, it feels like, at wide receiver. But for most of the year, it was clearly him. But yeah, you're right about Neighbors. I mean, that's just a total washout. Nothing you could do about a torn ACL early in the season. Although, with how the Giants offense ended up looking with, the early Russell Wilson days and then the transition to Dart and then Dart's hurts. Like, I don't know if it was going to be a top 5 season or a top 10 season for him anyway, had he stayed healthy. With Jefferson, you're just, victimized by the quarterback situation. I was of the belief that he was quarterback proof. That's not the case. Maybe nobody is quarterback proof, not even Justin Jefferson. And yeah, with Lamb, it felt to me like he had so many like potential big games, where you're like, oh man, Dak just missed him. And it's like every week these are starting to stack up where it's like, oh, he should have had a bigger game. He should have had a bigger game. Going into week 18, he only has 2 games all year with at least 20 fantasy points. It's like if you're going to be a top 5 wide receiver, you need 5, 6, 7 of those splashy type of games.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, like, wide receiver all year long, we were talking about the volatility at the position. It is the opposite of what the mentality was at wide receiver. It used to be like, okay, you get your stud wide receivers earlier, you're good, they're stable. They weren't stable this year. Early running backs were a right answer. There was a couple of good late running backs like Javonte Williams, but for the most part, your stud running backs, Bijan, Gibbs, although Gibbs had a terrible fantasy playoffs. McCaffrey was great. Henry fed families during the fantasy playoffs. Chase Brown was great in the fantasy playoffs. Achane was great. There's some wrong answers in there. I skipped over Barkley conveniently. I skipped over Genti, although, he had one great game in the fantasy playoffs. Bucky Irving was a disaster, but I feel like there was a little bit more stability in running back. If you had the right answers at running back, you saw a lot of those as consistent league winners.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was something I was thinking about, during our Sirius XM show this morning, where it's like, Bijan, Gibbs, McCaffrey, even Henry, he's RB7 right now. He was RB6 in the NFFC. Achane, he was RB7 in ADP. He's going to finish as RB6. It's like the majority of the big timers at running back worked out for you. And even, Saquon, it wasn't a total disaster. It clearly was nothing close to last season. He didn't return a top 5 or 6 ADP. So I think that goes down as an L, but it wasn't like he had an Ash Agenti, like, can I start this guy type of year? Like you were still confidently starting Saquon. You still knew there was the potential for big games. It didn't necessarily work out. And even in that next year, I think Bucky Irving goes down as a loss, partially because of the injury, but even, the timing of him coming back, you're like, all right, I've been waiting for this. He's been in my IR spot. I get him back for the fantasy playoffs, and he has, a terrible 4 or 5 game stretch to end the season. Chase Brown, if you survive those first 7 or 8 weeks, he ended up being one of the best backs in the NFL over the second half of the season. I think you'll take this Josh Jacobs year. The injuries at the end, it kind of went out with a whimper, but on balance, the volume was there throughout the entire season. He was, for the most part, replicating last year's production. Kyron Williams, about what you'd expect as well. And then obviously Jonathan Taylor, in that same mix. I think James Cook has to go down as one of the bigger values, of course,
Indeed,
of the season.
he does.
And
he
one
does.
of the, almost a, I wouldn't say a consensus fade, but there was a wide ranging belief that if you took James Cook, at the end of round 2 or even, earlier in round 3, that you were taking a risk. And it turned out that, a Buffalo team that struggled to throw the ball all year had to lean even more heavily, I should say, on James Cook.
Indeed, except for yesterday or Sunday, where it just didn't work out. But he got you there. That's the point.
Right.
All you can ask is getting there, because the 2 previous weeks were great. He was great all season long. He was one of the right answers once again.
Right. And he even carried it 20 times in the Eagles game. It was a bad matchup at a bad time, of course, if you're in your fantasy final, but you weren't going through the Derrick Henry, like, why is he only carrying the ball 9 times in this game? With James Cook, like, the workload was ramped up even compared to last season. Just kind of scanning through more running back ADP here. There, I think we correctly highlighted the dead zone, Jeff, when we were looking at, that Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Alvin Kamara, Chuba Hubbard, James Conner tier of running backs. You could even throw David Montgomery in there. I don't think you're really happy with any of those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of started even earlier. I mean, you lost Hampton to injury. Travion Henderson certainly had his ups and downs. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kamara obviously has missed the last part of the season. He never really paid off. Walker, no. You might not have even started him for his big game against the Rams because he was so frustrating the 2 previous weeks. Breece Hall, obviously the team just melted away around him. Hubbard lost his job. You have to get down to RJ Harvey to get a guy that you were kind of happy with what happened. Connor, who we've talked about multiple times, got hurt early. But that's exactly why you were fading him. You had to get down to DeAndre Swift to where you're happy again. And then, Pacheco was a disaster. Montgomery was a disaster. Aaron Jones and Charbonnet were disappointing. Yeah, it was a real big dead zone there.
Yeah, and I would even throw my guy Jordan Mason in there too, right? It's like he got the opportunity that we forecasted would happen, as far as, not trusting Aaron Jones to stay healthy. Aaron Jones lands on IR, and if I remember correctly, Mason had kind of one big game right away, and you're thinking, all right, this is why we took him. And then just kind of did nothing, as and that coincided, of course, with the McCarthy struggles and Brosmer moonlighting for the Vikings and just kind of the general downturn of that offense. But that did not end up being a hit by any means. I think we do have to highlight Travis Etienne as well. I'm looking at just total ADP from the NFFC, so this encompasses all drafts. We're not just looking at like the last week heading into the season. RB30. He was a borderline top 100 guy in total ADP.
Absolutely. And in the prime time, it was even worse. 33.
Yeah.
Right next to each other. Etienne and Javonte Williams, 33 and 34. So
those were the answers.
Those were right answers. If you got one of those 2 as your RB2 after waiting on them, congratulations. If you got Jaylen Warren, you're probably pretty happy with what you paid for him at RB29. Same thing there. But kind of funny. Right next to him was Caleb Johnson.
Yeah.
Hey, good luck there.
Well, it's interesting too that a lot of, and Caleb Johnson fits this to some degree, a lot of those, I would say handcuffs or this guy could take over the backfield running backs just didn't really work out. Those like pick 100 to pick 130 type of guys. You mentioned both Seattle guys. Quinshon Judkins was kind of a unique situation, of course. That there was some windfall there that really fell off toward the end. But like the Tank Bigsby, Trey Benson, Braylon Allen, you're taking a shot on Bashal Tootin or Jaden Blue. Like the idea of these guys sounded great. Really, none of those guys were startable at any point.
It's like you're looking at my RotoWire Dynasty League roster right now.
I promise I'm not.
Caleb Johnson, Jaden Blue. Oh, good times. Good
Yeah.
times there had by many or none at all. I want to talk about one other draft permutation, but before that, we got to share a quick note from our friends at Dabble. Dabble isn't just another DFS app. It's the ultimate social platform where you can connect with other fantasy sports lovers. Dabble lets you win big. You can win up to 5,000 times your money this football season. Starting with Dabble is easy. New users get $25 free when signing up. No deposit necessary. Check out the link in the episode description below to download Dabble right now. Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen. We're kind of reviewing the year that was championship week. Nick, one of the through lines is that if you paid up for quarterback, you probably aren't happy with the results. You did better by waiting. Just here are the top fantasy point earners according to RotoWire using our reports there for that. Josh Allen was the number one fantasy earning quarterback at 425 points. Okay, great. You feel pretty good with what you got at Josh Allen. 14 rushing touchdowns goes a long way. Drake Maye, number 2. Matthew Stafford, number 3. Trevor Lawrence, number 4. Lawrence obviously was huge in the fantasy playoffs. Dak Prescott, number 5. Justin Herbert, number 6. Caleb Williams, number 7. None of these guys were premium quarterback guys. They were all drafted after the top 10 quarterbacks. Maybe not Dak. Dak had some helium late in draft season, but 1 out of the first 7 were top 10 fantasy drafted quarterbacks.
Yeah, and only one, I believe, was top 12, right? So you're talking about like guys who are expected to be your starter. And when you're drafting quarterback late, maybe you double tap, and we can get into that minutia. But in the overall NFFC ADP, Caleb Williams, quarterback 13, Drake Maye, quarterback 14, Herbert 15, Trevor Lawrence 19, Matthew Stafford, quarterback 25 in ADP.
Yeah,
a guy who was not even drafted in a lot
got
of
a
leagues.
bad back. He'll never run. Why
Right.
would you ever take him?
You forget about the immortal chamber.
Yeah, exactly. It was a completely immortal. I'm so glad you remembered the name of that because it was driving me crazy without like having to look it up while we're talking. That talk about that there. Yeah, he wasn't even considered like, oh yeah, tie him with Puka. It's a sneaky stack. You can get Adams and Puka and Stafford, an easy stack to build in best ball. Didn't hear a lot of that there, which is kind of crazy.
Right. And Stafford to me was the, one of those guys on, a second quarterback, where you're like, all right, maybe last pick, I prefer him over Geno. I would prefer him over Darnold, who is actually a pretty good fantasy quarterback for most of the season. But, he was like in the same discussion as like Aaron Rodgers, and, Tua had a higher ADP than Matthew Stafford. I think the question is, how do we handle this going into next season? It's like, what do you possibly do, with Lamar Jackson? Some people I think are going to fade Lamar. I think others will really not dock him much at all. They'll respect the talent. They'll respect the resume that he's built. And I think there could be a buying opportunity on Lamar. It's like, are we going to go down the Joe Burrow path and hope that this is the year that he stays healthy? Jalen Hurts has been fine, but I think, the overall concerns about the direction of the Eagles offense are still there. And then, guys like Mahomes and Baker are kind of impossible to rank right now, given the circumstances.
Absolutely. Jaden Daniels is impossible to rank too while we're at it there. I first of all, I wonder, is there a dip that we can buy? Will it exist? And maybe maybe the offseason will inform a lot of that discussion, right? If we see that they've changed the coaching personnel again, or they've changed, maybe he's been traded. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways this could go. I mean, I think John Harbaugh could be out if they don't win against the Steelers. Maybe even if they do win against the Steelers this weekend.
Yeah, I think it's possible. If Harbaugh could, obviously if they beat the Steelers, they're not firing him before the playoffs. But if they then go into the postseason and get smacked in round 1, I think that could be on the table. Same goes for Todd Bowles in Tampa Bay. I don't know if there's ever been a coach more coaching for his job in a week 18 than Todd Bowles will be on Saturdays. So yeah, there are some situations certainly that we need to keep an eye on. I mean, Tampa Bay is a really tough one to me. It's like, is Mike Evans back with this team next season? Mm-hmm. They still have all that depth at wide receiver. Like they're clearly playing below their level, and that's, I think they are a team that if they were to make a change at head coach or offensive coordinator, I think a lot of people will jump back on the Buccaneers. We don't love that idea of, taking a quarterback in like, round 5 or 6. To me, that's never been an overly profitable strategy. There doesn't tend to be a huge difference between, the quarterbacks 6 through 10, and then, a lot of the names that we just mentioned, I think you're better off just kind of playing the late round game and, taking a couple shots on the Lawrences and the Staffords of the world. So I think we'll see people cool off on Baker Mayfield, but there's still too many appealing pieces to me in that Bucs offense overall.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what is going to happen with that team. And, I think we could be on his fourth coordinator in 4 years. And that's continuity matters. We talked about that with the Eagles. We kind of quietly haven't talked about that as much with the Bucs. Another thing too is, they've had historically bad offensive line luck this year too. Tristan Wirfs didn't play last week, for instance. I think it kind of eluded the radar a little bit that, okay, it's the Dolphins. They should be able to cook. Well, Wirfs has missed games since coming back from the major injury to have 2 other injuries this season. He had an oblique injury that caused him to miss a game earlier on. He missed the game last week against the Dolphins. They lost both their guards. They are really kind of hurting as far as all of this goes. So yeah, I get all that. There is going to be an interesting conversation. Are you inclined to just wait on quarterbacks next year?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's something I say I want to do every year. And then there's a couple leagues where I get enticed. And, 2 years ago, I had a lot of success, with with an early quarterback strategy. I had a lot of Lamar Jackson. This year, in the NFFC, for instance, actually ended up building a pretty solid team, but completely whiffed at quarterback. Jaden Daniels was sitting there at the end of the 4th round. And I was like, man, I know I said I don't want to go early quarterback, but if I could get Jaden Daniels at I think it was pick 47 or 48, I'm like, I just feel like I have to do this. That completely blew up, never really had the right guy behind him. And that ended up tanking the season. But yeah, I think what we laid out, it's not going to be like this every single year where you have, ADP 15, 19, 26. These guys are finishing top 5, but there's enough value there. And I think that upper tier that we thought was so rock solid, it's like, how could they fail, right? Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels. I think we were reminded that there's still a ton of volatility at quarterback, and injuries are the number one thing, but just general offensive malaise, I think can infect some of these guys as well when you look at Lamar and Hurts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the follow-up question has to be like, okay, you're waiting on quarterback. Drake, I did say I wanted to get some Drake Maye in my life. I only got 1 league with him. I wish I had a lot more. Do you have that guy identified yet for next year? Who's that going to break out at quarterback guy that you can save a lot of money, save a lot of draft picks with, and still add?
Is it Malik Willis? I don't know.
Could be.
I still think there could be a pretty reasonable price on a lot of these guys. And part of it'll be determined by how the postseason goes. Like if the Jags make a run to the Super Bowl, I don't know where we're going to see Trevor Lawrence drafted next year, but we have to keep in mind that there's still a ton of depth at the position, right? It's we can say we're skeptical of Lamar and Hurts and all these other guys, but it's like, okay, are you really going to put them behind Jared Goff? And, how high are we really drafting Drake Maye next season? Are you taking him over Joe Burrow? So I think, these discussions can be, a little bit different and hypothetical in terms of real life when you start to stack up the ADP. But, I've been really impressed by how Brock Purdy has finished the year. And, we'll see where he settles. Probably about the same, I would guess, as this year, QB 12, QB 13, somewhere in that range. I think he's somebody that could make another leap. Do you buy low on Bo Nix after what's been a mostly disappointing year for that offense?
I was just looking at that. He was drafted as QB8. He finished QB8.
Yeah, right.
It's just yeah, he's fine. He gets you a little bit of running, but he's not great. And but year 3, there's sometimes, I think we're spoiled. We expect these QBs to just, bust out right away.
Yeah.
And then we get disappointed when they don't in year 1 or year 2. And sometimes that's to our chagrin because you see a guy like Drake Maye doing that and you're like, oh yeah, this is what it looks like. But then again, Maye was a top 3 draft pick overall. Yeah. Nix wasn't. Nix was kind of pushed up in that draft class of quarterbacks too.
Well, I do wonder, are the quote unquote obvious, year 2 breakout guys, Tyler Shuck and or Cam Ward? I think a lot of that will depend on what is put around them, what changes from 2025 to 2026. But I think those are both guys who, to me, feel like they're clearly trending in the right direction as we get toward the end of the season. And, with Cam Ward, you can always pick out the good and the bad plays every week. I think he has the worst surrounding cast of maybe any quarterback in the NFL right now. So I'm willing to give him more benefit of the doubt maybe than others. But, if those teams make the right moves and put some real pieces around those two quarterbacks, I think everybody's feeling good about them right now. They're not going to be guys who are drafted in, the top, 15 quarterbacks next year. Like, those are still guys you could probably get QB, 18, 19 at the absolute highest.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the type of guys you're going to be shopping for if you do the wait on the quarterbacks game. So, right. And you get two of them. That's also one of the answers is the point of it is you wait and then you hope you hit gold and you take two or even three of those guys later on. And hopefully it clicks right away so you can make that decision to move on from one of them pretty quickly. That's the other part of the downside to. Downside to trying to wait on quarterback is you got to have a little bit of patience there because sometimes it takes a hot minute or two. It took Trevor Lawrence half the season to kind of starting to click with Liam Cohen, but he did eventually there.
So I want to look at tight end real quickly here. I know we're kind of jumping around and talking more 2026 to 2025, but I think that's appropriate given where we are in the season. Mm-hmm. Where's Trey McBride going? How high is Trey McBride going to be drafted? How big of a gap will there be for Trey McBride down to the next tight end? Right now, I'm seeing him at 302.4 total PPR points. Next highest tight end is Kyle Pitts at 199. So we're talking about north of a 100 fantasy point difference. That's roughly the same as going from Kyle Pitts down to Cade Otton, Evan Ingram.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive difference there. I got Dallas Goedert ahead of Pitts just barely in terms of fantasy points, but that might be the format you're playing in PPR versus standard or something like that. I mean, I think that's it, but the whole point is we're talking about that's the range. Is it Goddard? Is it Pitts? Is it Fannin? Who is the tight end 2? It's going to be Bowers. Obviously it's going to be the tight end 2, but who's the tight end 3? Is it Fannin? I don't know.
Is it Kittle?
It could be Kittle, but I mean, the health is such an obvious, huge problem there. And that doesn't feel like that's going to be getting any better. It's a really legitimate question. Yeah. I think McBride goes at the 1-2 turn is my guess. And the question is, do you go with it there? If you went with Bowers, you're obviously unhappy, but some people did go McBride that early and they're obviously very happy. I got, leagues where I got McBride, it was around the 2-3 turn. And obviously those teams, if you didn't botch the first couple of picks, you did well. If you got one of those elite running backs to pair with them, then you're pretty happy.
Right. I mean, depending on your matchup week to week, not only is Trey McBride like outpacing the rest of the field by a minimum of like 5 or 6 fantasy points per game, essentially in terms of guys who've stayed healthy, but there were a lot of weeks where if you have Trey McBride and you were going up against, I don't know, Dallas Goedert or Kyle Pitts, like these guys who have had objectively pretty successful seasons, like you were basically getting like a 20 to 25 point edge just on that position, right? Because there was such a drop off week to week. And then like if, I'm looking at week 11, for instance, 27.5 fantasy points out of Trey McBride. If your opponent started Kyle Pitts, they got 3.4. If they started Dallas Goedert, they got 4.4. Like the floor was so much lower for some of these other guys that if you had a down week with your run of the mill tight end going up against Trey McBride, it just granted you such an advantage. And I am a little bit wary of paying for the past production with McBride. It's like, it's highly unlikely that he outpaces the tight end 2 by 100 fantasy points again next season. And that's where you get into the debate of, okay, is he worth the 9th or 10th overall pick in a draft? If he repeats this and the rest of the field repeats how it went this year, yes. Is it likely to happen again next year? I would say probably not. We need to know who the quarterback is going to be for the Arizona Cardinals. Are they going to have any semblance of a running game? Are they going to be throwing it 45 times per game over the second half of the year? Probably not.
By the way, I was looking at that list in standard versus PPR, and what a massive difference between standard and PPR for Goddard in particular. He's tight end 2 in standard, and he's not top 10 in PPR. Yeah. That's kind of funny. He's probably regress to what is the question. Who's going to throw it to him is a huge question. Who's going to coordinate this team is probably going to be in coach this team is also in dispute, but it is such a massive difference. And the other funny thing, the other interesting thing is it's just the name brand tight ends that you did draft instead of McBride are just disastrous too. I mean, Kittle, at least like you got production when he played and hopefully he had replacement value, but Laporta was a disaster. Tyler Warren was fine early, but faded late. Hawkinson, a disaster. Kelsey, a disaster. Ingram, a disaster. Mark Andrews, a disaster. David Njoku a disaster. I mean, those are the rest of your top 10 tight ends in terms of ADP. Kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And like, as much as I love Warren and Loveland as players, I don't have a whole lot of enthusiasm that they're going to close that gap so much. Brenton Strange looks interesting. He's not going to close that gap so much. Yeah. It really is like McBride or bust, and Bowers, who knows, is going to be their QB or coach or whatever the heck the Raiders are going to do. And then this offseason as well. There's a lot of distrust factors there as well. He's great. He's awesome. But everything else is not so awesome.
Yeah. Will the Raiders field an NFL team in 2026? I don't know. We'll find out. The other interesting name in all this, Jeff, is actually a player who, before he went down, was outpacing Trey McBride. First 8 weeks of the season. He got hurt in week 9. Tucker Kraft.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought him up. I tend to bet against guys coming back from a major injury like that early on. So I'd probably take him after Kittle even. Yeah. We'll see after that. I mean, but that's just the point. Like, you either go premium tight end and super premium tight end, or you just wait forever, I feel like, at the position. Yeah. Loveland's going to be top 5. I think he's going to end up happening there for me as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's still Kraft over Loveland for me. I think given the timing of the injury, I trust that he'll be back. But Kraft he's one of those guys that even before the big injury in week 9, it felt like he was always getting banged up. He plays such a crazy physical style. It's Kittle like in some ways, right? Like he's like exposed to a higher injury risk than your average player.
Absolutely. Before we move on and talk about some of the Week 18 matchups and some of the key matchups that happened in Championship Week, here's a quick note from our friends over at DraftKings.
The NFL postseason is almost here, and playoff best ball on DraftKings is back. It's your home for playoff best ball, and this year it's bigger than ever because our partners at DraftKings are featuring a massive $3 million prize pool and a $1 million top prize in DraftKings' largest contest to date. Are you new to playoff best ball? Well, it's the easiest way to get involved in the playoff action without the weekly grind. Just draft once, and that's it. Each round, your top scores automatically count. That means no roster moves, no weekly management. Just build your squad and let it ride all postseason long. All you have to do is download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app and draft your playoff best ball lineup for a shot at the $1 million top prize. Drafts stay open until the postseason kicks off, so now's the time to jump in. You draft it, we crown it. So sign up now using the link in the episode description below to take your shot at $1 million in DraftKings' biggest playoff best ball contest ever. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY at 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-78-97-777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See terms at DraftKings.com. Sponsored by DraftKings.
Let's take a look ahead at the Saturday slate for Week 18. Excuse me. Bucs Panthers is going to open up our Week 18 slate. Like I joked on Monday, you could put this game on the moon at 1 p.m. on Monday, and it wouldn't change my mind. I wouldn't be upset about that. I'll watch because, hey, I watch every game, but it's hard to get too worked up about this game. From a fantasy perspective, obviously, we're going to be playing like DK, or we're going to be playing we're going to be playing individual players or things of that nature. There's ways to find value. In fact, I'll be talking with Alan Sislowski later on today. We're going to do a little early RotoWire value meter early podcast. He's going to be my Wednesday guy on Tuesday, but we'll talk about some of the ways you can play Week 18. But for this particular game, we've got the standard like 2.5 point game line here for favoring the Bucs. I think Carolina might win this game. I'm just that sour on the Bucs right now.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that this line, open 3.5 is now down to 2.5 in favor of Tampa Bay. Even with Carolina playing a very Carolina game last week against Seattle, where they hang in for a half, it's tied going into the third quarter, and then the turnovers start for Carolina, as they often do. It's not like the Panthers are like rolling into this matchup by any means, but the vibes are just so bad right now for Tampa Bay in every way, right? Like there are a lot of teams right now where you're worried about the defense or the offense isn't clicking. Like it's both right now for Tampa Bay. Like the defense, the secondary has been among the worst in the NFL for 5 or 6 weeks now. And it feels like it finds a way to sink lower and lower every single week. You're giving up long touchdowns to Theo Weiss last week against the Miami Dolphins in a game that looked close in terms of final score. Really wasn't that close. Like Miami was pretty comfortably, leading that game throughout the entire second half. And, the Bucs put up a touchdown with like 20 seconds on the clock. I don't know what Tampa Bay is doing offensively. You mentioned some of the injuries they've had, on the offensive line, not having Wirfs last week. Yeah, that matters, but they haven't been able to run the ball at all since Bucky Irving came back. They've been worse when healthy this season than they were early in the year when they were beating good teams, albeit in late game situations. But Baker clearly doesn't look like himself. He's playing like definitively a bottom 10 quarterback, if not lower, in the NFL right now. And there's a sense of desperation, I think, that you could start to feel now with Tampa Bay. And you saw it with some of the throws that Baker was attempting in that second half against Miami. It's like, it's the Dolphins, man. It's Quinn Ewers. Like, you can work your way back into this game.
Yeah.
And Baker ended up throwing him out of it.
Yeah. It's weird. They lost the game at Buffalo, but acquitted themselves well, right? Sure. Sean Tucker had a monster game in that game. And you're building on something here. This is something you can build on and continue. And after that, they got killed on the Sunday night game against the Rams, came home and had just a snooze fest of a game against Arizona where they won. That's the last time they won. And then, since then it's lose to New Orleans, lose to Atlanta at home. They had those 3 straight home games and just did very little. Lost the last 2 on the road. Sean Tucker, he's now all of a sudden a goal line only back again, which I kind of think that's a mistake. I think he was actually pretty good and they had a decent scheme cooked up and they just said, that never happened. We're going to go back to this. And this is not working.
No, nothing's working. Nothing's working right now for Tampa Bay. And, they've played a variety of opponents, a variety of like strengths of defense during this malaise. They've now lost 7 of their last 8 games, which is pretty amazing that they're still in this scenario to win the division. I mean, it just speaks to where the NFC South is overall. But like it was understandable, when you lose to the Patriots and the Bills and the Rams back to back. Now, the way that Rams game got away from them, I think maybe in retrospect should have been more concerning than it seemed at the time. But, they turn around, they beat the Cardinals, which at the time we're like, all right, Cardinals are this frisky team. They could beat anybody. That turned out to not be all that good of a win.
Right.
And, you played the Saints, Falcons, Panthers, and Dolphins in consecutive games and lost all of them and looked bad doing it. It's like there was not a single, in my opinion, like truly fluky result in there. It's like you could say the Falcons game was a little fluky because of all the shenanigans at the end, but Atlanta set the franchise record for penalties and still won that game. Like they deserve to win it. And if anything, some of those calls were pretty dubious, I thought, in the second half. So like this is not just some like, what's going on with the Bucs? Like this has been 2 months. It's weirdly similar to what we saw from the Eagles, a couple of years ago before they went into that game in the playoffs against Tampa Bay.
Right.
I think the most Bucs scenario here, of course, is that they win this game. The Panthers alternate wins and losses for 11 straight games to end the season. And then Atlanta wins on Sunday and knocks the Bucs out anyway.
That would be amazing.
Like, that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, that would be amazing. On the other side of the Carolina. I mean, Bryce Young was as bad as it gets against Seattle. And granted, it was bad weather as against Seattle. Threw for 54 yards. 54. He's eclipsed 200 yards 3 times all season. Yet the highs were crazy high. The 450 game against Atlanta. Then the week 2 weird game against Arizona. That should have told us more about Arizona than it did about Carolina. And then one other game where he got over 200 yards. Yet because he's led them to these comeback victories. That one, the other 200 game was against the Rams, though, for what it's worth. That was a good game. He did play very well, but Carolina on the road is terrible. They're okay, sometimes passable at home, but even at home they've had some dog games as well. Your leader for the offensive rookie of the year odds is Teteroa McMillan, minus 110 at some places, minus 135 at DraftKings. His one catch was for 5 yards, and it was the saddest 5-yard catch of all time. It was short of the 6 on a 4th and 12, 4th and longer like that.
I think it was longer than that even. Yeah.
It was sad. It was just utterly sad. It was only catch all game. I mean, yet he's the offensive rookie of the year leader right now. Just weird year all the way around.
Yeah. Bad field for offensive rookie of the year. No question about that. McMillan's had a fine season. He's going to have a chance to eclipse 1,000 yards this week. Like the season long numbers actually look better to me than it's felt. Like I don't recall him stacking up 7 touchdowns throughout the season, because every time I've started McMillan or, bet an anytime touchdown. It seems like he has 4 for 38, and that's that. But the bar is pretty low right now for offensive rookie of the year. In theory, this could be a decent Bryce Young spot just because of how bad that Buccaneers defense has been. I mean, they're second in fantasy points given up to quarterbacks. So as far as if you're playing a Saturday DFS contest and you want to save money at quarterback, it's like there's at least a path to this being a decent day for Bryce Young, but there's just still not a lot of upside to me. And I'm curious, if Carolina doesn't make the postseason, how much do they weigh, almost making it in a year when the division was historically bad, when they kind of decide is Bryce Young still the guy? Do we explore other options? Again, the idea of Malik Willis with that team, with that coordinator, to me would be pretty appealing. But when you have such a level of investment in Bryce Young, that's easier said than done.
I was just going to say, you got to have the Bryce Young discussion, win or lose this weekend.
I think so.
I still think you have to have that discussion. Are they winning because of him? Are they winning because
Absolutely
of their defense? I think it's more the defense and the offensive line than anything, and opponents, and just taking advantage of the right spots. And yet it's hard to square that with wins over the Rams at Green Bay. I mean, those are a couple of really good wins, although the Green Bay game win is looking less good over time. But still, at the time that happened, when they were going up against Micah Parsons, when they were going, Tucker Kraft got hurt in that game, so that's part of it there. But they were winning at the half before Kraft got hurt. I mean, that was kind of the point, is they were playing their style of game, imposing their style on the Packers in that game, which is just bonkers, bizarro, and then sweeping the Falcons, of course, too.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like every win that they've stacked up, there's a very specific set of circumstances have had to unfold. It's like you absolutely need multiple turnovers. You probably need a defensive touchdown. You need, in Green Bay's case, them to kind of coach their way out of winning that game. They were terrible in the red zone. Green Bay didn't punt in that game. They're 0-3, by the way, in games in which they have not punted this season. And you're always left scratching your head. How did that happen? There have been very few games where it's that was a definitive Carolina Panthers win. And I think if they're smart, that is something they'll realize. It's still not a very good roster, right? There's plenty of additions that can be made. They're still overall moving in the right direction, but you also have to look at the future of this division. It should be pretty winnable again next year. Who knows what's going to go on this offseason with the Buccaneers? They could be looking at a new head coach, maybe a new coordinator. The Saints have picked up some momentum, but there's a lot of building that needs to be done there. So there might be kind of this idea of going forward in the short term because of how gettable the division is, but I still think there's a lot of need for internal improvement in that offense. To close the book on Carolina, by the way, did not have a passing play that went longer than 8 yards in that Seattle game. That is wild. That's
cringy. It's very cringy there. It's watching a bad high school football game, basically. There. Pretty much. The other Saturday game is the best game of the week. Seattle against San Francisco. It shouldn't be on Saturday. I won't belabor that point. It's just I wish we had that at full rest, but it's the battle for the NFC West. It's the battle for the number 1 seed. The winner of that game is the number 1 seed in the NFC. And that's massively important this year, obviously, given how loaded the NFC side of things is. Yep. Started off on the Seattle side of the ball. They've been slumping lately. That game was 3-3 against Carolina at halftime. They've had multiple games where they've struggled early on in games offensively. What's your level of confidence they come out firing against the Niners?
Well, given how the Niners defense has looked, they better come out firing, right? It's like if this is another sluggish start for Seattle, I think you do have to be a little concerned heading into the playoffs. I will tell you this is just a total anecdote, but in my various group chats with Packers fans, I polled them earlier today and said, all right, let's say Green Bay gets Chicago in the wild card. They win that game, and then you're automatically playing the number 1 seed. Would you rather face the 49ers and that defense that we just saw on full display the other night, or would you rather face Sam Darnold? And it was a unanimous, give us Sam Darnold, which I thought was interesting because of just how vulnerable San Francisco has looked. But I think there is still kind of this prevailing lack of faith in Seattle offensively. And you mentioned the slow starts. I actually did some homework on that, Jeff. So last 7 games for the Seattle Seahawks. Here are their first half scores. Tied 3-3 against Carolina, down 13-7 against the Rams, down 13-6 against Phillip Rivers and the Colts, tied 6-6 against Kirk Cousins and the Falcons, up 13-0 against Minnesota, Max Brosmer, up 16-3
right before that.
Yes, exactly. Up 16-3 against Tennessee and down 14-9 against the LA Rams. So 4 of 7 games without a touchdown in the first half. They have 1 first quarter touchdown in their last 7 games, 0 or 3 points in 6 of their last 7 first quarters.
Yep. The last time they were really rolling was against Arizona. And remember, they got 2 very similar defensive touchdowns in that game. They lost their center in that game. And starting in the second half of that Arizona game is where they just were a completely different team.
Yep.
They have not had like a full good offensive game since then. It's just wild to see from such a good team. It was exactly the formula that I was worried about at the start of the season with Seattle I had already declared defeat. So I can't go back and reclaim any sort of victory talk about that. I was very concerned about Darnold behind that line and the shakiness was there. And that's why, like, I was on the under on their win total this year. I was aggressively wrong on that there. I cannot claim any sort of victory, like even under the theory, but now I'm scared. I'm scared about them in the playoffs again. We'll see. This is theoretically another good matchup. San Francisco can't rush the passer at all. So this should be a good week for Darnold and JSN.
Yeah.
The Niners have 18 sacks on the season, none against the Bears last week. They don't have a pass rush.
No, and it was glaringly obvious that the few times that they did get pressure on Caleb Williams, they basically had to bring the house to do it. Yep. And had reasonable success. And we saw Green Bay had success against the Bears with that too. Where that's Caleb, for as much progress as he's made this season, it still feels like if you can get like immediate pressure on him, he just backpedals and whips the ball, and half the time it's going to be an intentional grounding. And I think the Niners had a couple spots in the second half where they were able to force some throwaways, but they kind of have to go into desperation mode just to get token pressure, that a team like Seattle does not have to work for in order to do that. But with the Seahawks, there's always going to be the Darnold thing. Like, until proven otherwise, it's going to be in the back of your mind. It's like James Harden, I think, in the NBA, right? Where it's like, this guy wins a ton of games. He puts up a ton of numbers in the regular season, but we are reminded annually that you cannot trust him in the playoffs. We don't have that big of a sample, of course, with Sam Darnold. He could absolutely turn it around. This would be the right situation to do it. But I think even the most ardent Seahawks fans would tell you, like, yeah, of course we're worried about this heading into the playoffs. And I think that's why it's probably extra important for Seattle to get that 1 seed, because, it's not quite as wide open as the AFC, where it feels like any team could lose in any single game. I don't think it's quite like that in the NFC, but I don't know. There's not going to be easy matchups, looking at the 2-7 and the 3-6.
Yeah, absolutely. The only positive I'd say from Seattle is they've gotten the running game going the last 2 weeks, but positive offensive thing. Defense, there's plenty of positives, but Walker 2 weeks ago, Charbonnet last week. So the problem is, can't count on which one that's going to go off on a particular week. Yeah. If either, it could be none. And the Niners sneakily, they are a little tough against the run. Running backs haven't really had a field day against them all too often. So that part of it there is a little bit nervous. It really has to be Darnold overcoming it this week there for them to kind of get out. Cause I think the Niners are going to get some points against the Seattle defense. I think it'll be a lot like 2 weeks ago where the Rams were able to move the ball. I think it'll be tough because I think the Seahawks defense is awesome, but at the same time, Purdy and this offense, the Niners offense is rolling.
Seahawks defense is phenomenal. And, we mentioned some of those games in that stretch where they've struggled offensively. The defense continues to bail them out. And I think that's been consistent enough. Like, you can't count on a pick six every single week, but like, they've done it enough times where it's like, yeah, maybe once or twice in the playoffs, you are going to get a play like that. But they've also feasted, I think, on bad quarterbacks. Like, the really good Seattle defense games have come against like Rattler and Brosmer and Brissett, and I think they have shown a little bit more weakness when you're going up against a competent play calling team, a competent quarterback. And the way the Niners are playing right now, I mean, they're absolutely in that category.
Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about the week 18 slate and maybe the other games that, someone has something to play for. But first, got a quick note from our friends at Playoff Blitz. So check this out. If you're like us and hate when your fantasy season ends before the real football gets good, you've got to try playoffblitz.com. It's fantasy football built for the NFL playoffs. No draft, no waivers, no sweat. Members just pick a lineup each week from the playoff teams. You can only use each player once. So once you start a player, you lose them. That's where the strategy kicks in. Remember, no need to hold a draft. Just create a league and invite your friends. Starting a league is super easy. It takes less than a minute, and you're all in from wildcard weekend to the Super Bowl. PlayoffBlitz.com is your home for fantasy playoff football. Leagues are $79, and you can invite as many people as you like. Run an office pool, invite your league mates from your regular season leagues or even your grandma's bingo league. Join today at playoffblitz.com, where fantasy football meets the Super Bowl. Enter promo code ROTOWIRE for a discount on your league today. All right, Nick, let's talk a little bit about the other Week 18 games. It's tough to find teams that have something to play for, but we clearly have that on Sunday night. Pittsburgh versus Baltimore. It's the AFC analog to the NFC South, the AFC North. Someone's got to win. Someone gets to host a playoff game.
Yeah, I think this is a little less sad than what we're seeing in the NFC South, right? Where, Tampa Bay is just slowly bleeding out. Nobody really trusts Carolina. We just went through the numbers on them. I'm excited for this game. It feels like a total toss-up, whereas, Baltimore is playing better right now. They might get Lamar Jackson back in the mix. I think might be too little too late, but we saw what everybody's been clamoring for, which is just give Derrick Henry the ball against vulnerable defenses, and it's going to result in production. And I think the Pittsburgh defense is that. There's certainly been some times where they've stepped up this season, but they've also had some terrible performances against the run. So it really comes down to, to me, Baltimore's the better team. They're the more talented team. They have better players. Do we trust them to execute versus a Steelers team that I think has shown to be better coached overall, has a veteran quarterback who's plenty familiar in these situations, but has significantly worse personnel and won't have DK Metcalf.
Right. And we saw how I underestimated how badly they missed Metcalf. And Calvin Austin in that same game. They Roman Wilson was a healthy scratch, which is an indictment to their drafting ability too from the year before. They used to be the team that could find the second or third round wide receiver, and they haven't done that in a while either. That's just kind of another issue they've got going on. They lost Darnell Washington in that game too. That took away, when you're going with 17 tight ends, losing one of them is probably a bad thing for your offense. But yeah, it was just a big mess. I mean, the goal line sequence at the end of the game where they go to cast off Marcus Valdes-Scantling 3 times and don't come close in any 3 of those attempts kind of spoke to their issues right now.
Yeah, there's a good film breakdown going around Twitter yesterday of some cut-ups, of Aaron Rodgers late in that game, just kind of doing his own thing from what it looked like. Had guys open, had secondary options, and was just kind of locking in on Adam Thielen and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. That is where we are right now in the Steelers offense. And, you got to give credit to Cleveland. I thought that defense had been slipping in recent weeks. I thought they were kind of coasting on the early season reputation. The Steelers, I think, led to their own demise in a lot of ways, but still, that was a great performance to slow down both Warren and Gainwell, who have basically been the Steelers offense for a good chunk of the season. We'll see on Baltimore, though. I'm not 100% sold on that defense. We know a lot of the names. I don't think they've necessarily played up to that level this season. I will not be surprised if either team wins this game. I do think if you are, if you're the 5 seed in the AFC, which is currently occupied by Houston and will likely continue to be occupied by Houston, I think you'd rather play Pittsburgh than you would Baltimore, even though the Ravens have kind of shown us, maybe this isn't just our year. I still think you'd rather go up against the Steelers than have to face Lamar and Derrick Henry in a playoff game.
100%. And with the Ravens, talk about the offensive side first. Is it really as simple as hey, we have this guy named Derrick Henry. He's really good and we should give it to him more often? Because that's what it seemed like, that they just, they maybe they're forced into doing the right thing. Maybe all the blowback from benching him in that, at the end of the New England game was enough to shame them into doing the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it, of course, was having Snoop Huntley out there, right? So it just, you don't feel like you have your full suite of normal offensive passing game.
That's what I mean by forced into it.
Yeah, right. I think in some ways they were forced into it, and it turned out to be an excellent strategy. But I wouldn't have necessarily thought that going into the game. Micah Parsons brings more value as a pass rusher than a run stuffer. I think he's been better in that area than he's given credit for. But even without Parsons, without Devontae Wyatt, the Packers had still been a solid run defense, not at the level they were when both those guys were healthy. But this wasn't a total pushover defense like we saw on Saturday night. They had been like the best tackling team in the NFL, and that completely fell apart. So maybe it is the Ravens finally putting it together at the right time. At the same time, you're going up against a Packers team with injuries. Didn't even have their starting quarterback. I think this game could have turned into more of a shootout. Even if we didn't have to see Clayton Tune come in for 2 plays and immediately throw a pick, I think that kind of changed the entire course of the game where it was back and forth. So I'm trying to be wary of not going too much recency bias with the Baltimore Ravens. Yes, that was a very impressive game. I think they did learn something. I think you can't go back to giving Derrick Henry the ball 11 times in this game, but I still am not ready to trust this team because, again, the bigger sample suggests that even when they've had Lamar Jackson at close to full health, it hasn't looked like the Ravens.
Right. And the Steelers will be better against the run than the Packers were on Saturday night too.
By default.
Yeah, exactly. It's worth noting Malik Willis didn't get stopped in this game. You know, the only time is like other players would mess up would be the only reason why they had a bad center exchange again there. That's one thing to watch for. But, you know, hey, Willis acquitted himself very well, and not for the first time. You know, I thought he did so well, you know, again in the Bears game the week before, for that matter, too. I thought, you know, he played pretty well in that. Earlier in the season when Love was banged out, Willis played well. Remember the Giants game? He came in for a series, led him on a touchdown drive. I think he's set, and he's a free agent at the end of the year. He's going to be a very interesting name in this offseason when we're looking, because let's face it, there aren't that many good names out there.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention the 2.5 games that he won for them last year as well, right? You know, the Love goes out in that Brazil game against Philly, and, you know, Willis comes in and beats the Colts. He beats the Titans back-to-back weeks, you know, not exactly Titanic wins, but there were very low expectations heading into those two. And then I think it was the Jags game in the middle of the year where Love went out again and Willis came in and picked up the save. So, I mean, it's really spanned 2 seasons. And, you know, those wins over the Colts and the Titans, those were extremely run-heavy games. You know, they were limiting Willis. They were pounding Josh Jacobs. Like, that's not really the version of Willis that we've seen these last couple of weeks. Like, obviously, he's making plays with his legs, but I encourage you to look at his passing chart from this game. Like, yeah, it looks super efficient, but if you dig in on where those throws were going, I mean, he was hitting everything down the field. And credit to Matt LaFleur for scheming things up, because he did have plenty of open wide receivers. But this was not just, you know, Malik Willis having an efficient night because he was dinking and dunking his way to 18 of 21 passing. It's like these were high level throws down
shot
the field.
Plays. Absolutely. Yeah. The opening drive, 2 long passes, you know, basically hit that there. Yeah, absolutely. So I think he set himself up pretty well. There's a number of teams that could use him. You know, he could get the Justin Fields contract, you know, 2 and 40 or something like that. And he'd be, you know, because not every team's going to be able to draft their quarterback. A lot of teams are going to be looking for a quarterback this offseason. And I think he's going to be an upgrade over what they currently have. So he definitely acquitted himself well. They're one team, though, the Packers, that probably won't have anything to play for. They've already said pretty much as much. Josh Jacobs was a ghost in this last game. He probably will be so again this week. You know, you look through it here, especially the AFC. The Chargers have already announced that, you know, Justin Herbert's not going to play. The Bills really don't have much reason to play Josh Allen. I mean, by default, they could beat the Jets probably with Trubisky and still get the 6th seed. And that, you know, that's probably a boon for them a little bit there. They'd rather be the 6th and the 7th, I would guess. But you know, there's not really too many teams out there in the AFC that have a lot to deal with this weekend.
Yeah, not really. I mean, obviously a lot can still happen seeding wise, but, you know, the Chargers have already tipped their hand. You know, we would expect Denver to be able to take care of business and end up as the 1 seed. You know, New England is in an interesting situation because it looks like the 1 seed, if Denver takes care of business, would be off the table. But if they lose and the Jags win, they would drop from the 2 to the 3. I think you'd still rather prefer to beat the 2, of course, in that situation. Like, to me, that's a bigger difference than the 6 versus the 7. You know, Buffalo, again, assuming the Chargers are punting this game, you know, they could kind of then decide, all right, do we prioritize rest? Do we care if we're the 7? Do we want to play, you know, likely Jacksonville? Do we feel better about a matchup with New England? I don't think they'll tip their hand. I don't think teams will, you know, they don't want to tell you going in, like, here's what we want to face. But I think we'll find out over the course of Sunday, you know, some leans of, oh, interesting. Okay, maybe they don't care if they win this game. Maybe they are trying to set up this specific matchup.
Right. A lot of intrigue as far as that goes with the Jaguars. Jaguars could still be the number 1 too, right? Because I think they've got they got the tiebreaker.
They need Denver to lose and New England to lose, and they need to win.
And Denver's not going to, you know, newsflash, Denver's not going to lose because the Chargers are starting Trey Lance against them. So, I mean, that's probably not going to happen. But it's kind of funny just to think about that. Their dream on that just a little bit. Should be a lot of fun, though, still to see that. I can't wait for the playoffs themselves to start. It's been a fun fantasy season, a little bit more fun in the fantasy regular season than fantasy playoffs, but still been fun doing these pods. We'll still do it. You know, we'll still talk a lot on SiriusXM Fantasy. You're going to catch a lot of us there. Don't worry, we're not going to be scarce. But I want to thank everybody that tuned in all season long to this podcast on Tuesdays, and especially if they jumped in on the live stream. Appreciate everybody that's doing all the comments as well. I've got Alan Soslowski later on today. It'll post as a podcast on Wednesday, but we're going to talk about what we can play in Week 18. So tune in for that as well. That'll be at 5 Eastern time. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Take care.